Daniel Cross, a 38-year-old U.S. Army Ranger who survived Afghanistan, had come to Windmere seeking nothing more than silence. His only companion was Scout, a German shepherd who had once served beside him in the K-9 unit. Together they lived quietly in a small apartment at the edge of town, trying to forget the noise of war. But peace is never simple. One night, a cry for help pulled Daniel back into a world he thought he had left behind. A storm, a missing child, a gunfight in the dark. Each moment tested not his strength, but his heart. In saving others, Daniel found something he didn't know he'd lost: faith, purpose, and a place to belong. Windmere no longer needed a soldier, it needed a watchman. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Rain drifted over Windmere in soft gray sheets, the kind that blurred streetlights into halos and left the air heavy with the smell of pine and rust. The town sat quietly at the edge of nowhere, its streets half empty, its people used to silence. To most, Windmere was forgettable. To Daniel Cross, that was exactly the point. At 38, Daniel had lived more lives than he cared to count. U.S. Army Rangers, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 ambush that took his team and nearly his sanity. He carried no visible wounds, but the ones beneath his ribs still woke him in the small hours. His therapist had told him, "You can't outrun silence, Daniel. You have to live inside it." So he moved to Windmere, a small town that didn't ask questions, with Scout, his 7-year-old German shepherd, once his K-9 partner overseas. The two settled into a ground-floor apartment at the far end of Hawthorne Street, where the street lamps hummed and the woods began. The place smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, but Daniel liked its stillness. He spent his mornings fixing what little furniture he owned and his evenings walking Scout through the misty streets. People sometimes waved, but few approached. It was easier that way. That Friday night, rain fell steady and cold. Daniel had just finished his usual loop past the diner when Scout stopped abruptly, tail stiff. The dog's ears pricked toward the narrow alley by the hardware store. Daniel followed his gaze. A figure stood half hidden in the shadows, tall but unsteady, leaning against the brick wall. The man's clothes hung in tatters, his face half covered by a hood, but his posture wasn't that of a drunk. Then Daniel saw the glint of something metallic behind him, a reflection in a puddle. A second shadow moved. At the same time, a patrol car rolled slowly past the corner. From it stepped Officer Rachel Hayes, her flashlight cutting a pale beam through the rain. She was in her early 30s, tall and lean, with brown eyes that caught everything, and hair tied in a tight knot beneath her cap. Known for her composure, Rachel had the calm of someone who'd seen fear before and learned to breathe through it. She was checking the closed shops, unaware of the figures lurking just beyond the light. Scout let out a low growl. Daniel raised a hand, a silent signal from old habits, and whispered, "Don't move." Rachel turned at the sound, startled to see a man and his dog at the alley's mouth. "Sir, you can't—" "Don't talk," Daniel said, his voice rough but steady. "Just listen." Something in his tone, measured, commanding, made her freeze. Scout's growl deepened. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw motion, the second man slipping from the shadows, a knife glinting in his hand. Instinct took over. He pushed forward just as the attacker lunged. In one motion, he caught the man's wrist, twisted hard, and sent him sprawling into the puddled omidis, concrete. The knife clattered away. Rachel drew her weapon, but Daniel was already moving, pressing the assailant face down, knee on his back. The other figure bolted from the wall, but Scout lunged, knocking him off balance, teeth bared but not biting, just enough to stop him. Daniel's voice cut through the rain, sharp and low. "Stay down!" Within moments, Rachel's radio crackled as backup was called in. Red and blue lights splashed across the wet brick. Officers poured in, shouting commands, weapons drawn. Daniel stepped back, hands raised, breathing hard. Scout sat at his heel, calm as if nothing had happened. Rachel holstered her gun and looked at him, really looked. His flannel shirt clung to his frame. His face was angular, unshaven, eyes shadowed, but intensely clear. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to rest. "You knew," she said quietly. "You saw them before I did." Daniel shrugged, wiping rain from his brow. "Old habits. Bad corners make good hiding spots." One of the officers approached. "Sir, we'll need your statement." Daniel nodded. "I live just down the street," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the darker end of Hawthorne. "You know where to find me." Rachel hesitated. "Name?" "Daniel Cross." She repeated it softly, committing it to memory. "You from around here, Mr. Cross?" "Just moved in," he said, giving Scout's collar a small tug. "Trying out quiet for a change." Before she could ask more, he turned away, his boots splashing through the rain, Scout trotting beside him. His posture was rigid, straight-backed, the kind of man who never truly stopped standing at attention. Rachel watched as he disappeared into the dim streetlights, swallowed by drizzle and distance. Something about his silence lingered with her, not cold, but weighted, like a secret carried too long. Later that night, as she wrote her report, her pen paused over one line. Assisted by local resident Daniel Cross, believed to be a military veteran. Demonstrated advanced tactical awareness. She stared at the words, unsure why they mattered. Outside, at the far end of town, Daniel locked his door and hung his soaked jacket on the hook by the entryway. Scout shook himself dry, then padded over and lay down with a quiet sigh. Daniel sat for a long moment, listening to the hum of rain against the window. He wasn't sure what had driven him to act. Instinct, maybe, or something else. For months he had tried to live small, unnoticed. But that night, for the first time in a long while, he had felt something other than numbness, purpose. He reached down and scratched behind Scout's ear. "You did good, boy." Scout thumped his tail once, then closed his eyes. Through the rain-streaked glass, the town lights flickered faintly, and somewhere in that fragile stillness, Daniel Cross, soldier, survivor, wanderer, realized he might have just stepped into the one story he hadn't planned to live. Morning sunlight crept through the blinds of Daniel's small apartment, painting thin gold stripes across the floorboards. The storm from 2 nights before had rinsed Windmere clean. Now the town moved lazily beneath a pale sky, as if trying to forget that anything violent had ever happened here. But for Officer Rachel Hayes, the memory of that night refused to fade. She sat at her desk in the small police station off Main Street, sipping lukewarm coffee and rereading the report she had written. Assisted by local resident Daniel Cross, possible former U.S. Army Ranger. There were no follow-up details, no address beyond Hawthorne Street, South End. But his voice still echoed in her mind, calm, commanding, deliberate. "Don't talk, just listen." The kind of voice trained to lead under fire. Curiosity wasn't part of the job description, but gratitude was. And so, on her next day off, she drove to Hawthorne Street with a small box of donuts and 2 coffees. A legal thank you, she told herself, though she knew it was more than that. The apartment building sat at the very edge of town, low and narrow, with faded siding and a porch that creaked when she stepped on it. A pickup truck, old, army green, and half disassembled, sat in the driveway. Tools lay neatly arranged on a tarp. Beside the truck, Scout watched her approach, head tilted, tail still but not hostile. His coat caught the sunlight, revealing streaks of bronze beneath the sable. "Hey there," Rachel said softly, crouching slightly. "You must be Scout." The dog gave a quiet chuff, not quite a bark, more like acknowledgement. From behind the open hood of the truck, a man's voice replied, "He doesn't usually greet strangers." Rachel straightened. Daniel Cross emerged from the shadow of the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He wore a faded navy flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up over scarred forearms, and a plain gray t-shirt beneath. His jeans were worn thin at the knees, boots scuffed, the look of a man who fixed more than he owned. His dark hair was still damp from a recent shower, but the stubble on his jaw gave him a certain rugged calm, the kind that comes from choosing silence over words. "Officer Hayes?" he said, nodding politely. "Didn't expect to see you out here." "I thought I'd stop by," Rachel replied, holding up the donut box with an awkward smile. "Official police business, returning thanks." His mouth twitched almost a smile. "That's new. Usually you folks show up with citations, not pastries. Consider it a first." She handed him a cup. "Black, no sugar. You look like the type." Daniel took it, the faintest amusement flickering in his eyes. "You profiling me now?" "Call it experience." For a few moments they stood in comfortable quiet, the hum of wind through pine trees, Scout padding around their feet, the smell of oil and coffee, mingling in the morning air. Rachel looked around the place. Everything was orderly, practical, nothing decorative except a framed photograph on the porch table. 5 soldiers in desert uniforms, one of them unmistakably Daniel, younger, smiling faintly, his arm around a K9 with Scout's same amber eyes. "You were Rangers?" she asked. Daniel's eyes followed hers to the photo. He nodded once. "Afghanistan, Helmand Province, long time ago." "What made you leave?" He hesitated. The silence stretched. "Ambush," he said finally. "Half the team didn't make it back." "I did, and that's sometimes harder." Rachel's gaze softened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, voice even but distant. "They were the best men I ever knew. I just wasn't one of them anymore after that." She watched the way he said it. Not bitter, just tired. A man still carrying ghosts, but too proud to admit it. Changing the subject, she glanced at the truck. "She yours?" "Used to be my unit supply rig. Bought it from an auction. She's stubborn, but she runs." "You talk about trucks the way I talk about suspects," she teased lightly. That earned an actual smile, brief but genuine. Both tend to backfire when you least expect it. They shared a quiet laugh. Scout, sensing the mood, pressed his head against Rachel's leg, earning a scratch behind the ear. "You know," she said, "there's a community training event next weekend. Basic first aid, disaster drills, that kind of thing. We always need more hands, especially people who know what they're doing." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not much for crowds." "It's not about crowds," she replied. "It's about helping people stay alive. You did that once for me." He didn't answer right away. The breeze rustled the nearby pines, carrying the faint scent of sap and old rain. Finally, he said quietly, "I'll think about it. That's all I ask." She stepped back toward her car, but before she opened the door, she turned. "You know, Mr. Cross, the quiet doesn't have to be punishment." He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the words. "Sometimes it's the only thing that listens." Rachel smiled sadly. "Then maybe you just need better company." He almost chuckled at that, shaking his head as Scout watched her go. When her cruiser pulled away, Daniel stood for a while in the driveway, coffee cooling in his hand. He looked down at the dog. "She's trouble," he murmured. Scout's tail wagged once, as if agreeing. Inside, Daniel set the donut box on the counter. One bite told him it was too sweet, but he finished it anyway. His eyes drifted to the photo of his team again. Sand, sun, laughter frozen in time. He ran a thumb across the frame, whispering under his breath, "Guess I'm still here, Ramirez." Outside, the sound of Rachel's engine faded down the hill for the first time since moving to Windmere. Daniel realized the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt like room for something new. The following Saturday dawned cold and bright. A thin mist rolled off the Windmere River, wrapping the town in a pale shimmer. The air smelled of wet pine and exhaust from the sheriff's trucks lined up outside the community training hall, a squat brick building that used to be a high school gym. Inside, a crowd was gathering: officers, volunteers, veterans, and curious locals. At the back of the hall, Daniel Cross stood near the door, hands buried in the pockets of his worn Carhartt jacket, Scout sitting obediently at his side. The dog's amber eyes flicked over the crowd, ever alert. Daniel had almost turned around twice on the way there. Crowds weren't his thing, but Rachel's voice had stayed in his head since she visited. It's not about crowds. It's about helping people stay alive. He had shown up 15 minutes late, hoping to blend into the background. It didn't work. Rachel spotted him immediately, standing near the folding chairs, her brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her uniform jacket unbuttoned over a gray shirt. She was in her element here, giving directions, greeting people, steady but approachable. When she saw him, a small smile softened her face. "Didn't think you'd actually come," she said, handing him a name tag. "I didn't either," he replied. Scout sniffed the air as if agreeing, tail flicking once. Rachel pointed toward a group at the front. "We've got a few instructors from the state academy, plus a handful of vets. You can just watch if you want." "I'll watch," Daniel said quickly. "Talking isn't my strong suit." She grinned. Fair enough. For the first hour, the event unfolded smoothly. CPR demos, evacuation procedures, radio training. Daniel lingered near the exit, absorbing rather than participating. But then one of the coordinators, a gray-haired man in a volunteer medic vest, called out, "We've got a veteran here who probably knows more about survival than all of us combined. Mr. Cross, right? You mind giving us a quick rundown on field first aid?" Daniel froze. Heads turned. Rachel's encouraging nod didn't help much. He cleared his throat, scratching at the scar on his wrist, an old habit when cornered. "It's just about staying calm," he said, voice rough. "You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. Keep pressure on wounds, stop bleeding first, breathing second, then move. That's it. Simple, efficient." His kind of words. But then someone in the crowd, a younger officer with a crew cut, spoke up, half joking. "He sounds like one of those Helmand vets. My uncle served there. Says the place was hell." The word hit Daniel like a gunshot. Helmand. Suddenly, the room blurred. The smell of coffee turned to dust. The fluorescent light flickered into the harsh glare of desert sun. He heard it again. Rotor blades, shouting, the snap of bullets. His pulse surged, his hand clenched instinctively, as if reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Scout shifted closer, whining softly, sensing the shift. Rachel was on her feet in seconds. "Hey," she said gently, her voice cutting through the noise in his head. "Daniel, it's okay. You're here. You're safe." Her tone wasn't pitying, just steady. She guided him quietly outside, away from the curious stares, to the edge of the parking lot where the air was cold and real again. He leaned against the brick wall, eyes closed, trying to slow his breathing. Scout pressed close to his leg, anchoring him back to the present. After a long silence, he muttered, "Guess that's why I don't do crowds." Rachel stood beside him, not touching him, just near enough. "You don't have to explain." He looked at her then, eyes tired. "You ever feel like the past doesn't just visit, it camps out and refuses to leave?" Rachel gave a faint smile. "Every cop does, I think. But yours, it's heavier. Still, you're not the only one carrying ghosts." He studied her face, strong lines softened by fatigue, the faint bruise under her eye from a training session. "You've lost people too," he said quietly. She nodded. "Partner, 5 years ago, routine traffic stop turned bad. I used to think if I'd parked 10 feet closer, maybe—" She stopped, exhaling. "You know the rest." Daniel looked away, jaw tight. You think if you replay it enough times, it'll hurt less. But it doesn't. It just becomes part of the air you breathe. Then maybe you just need cleaner air, she said. He almost smiled. You always talk like that? Only when I'm trying to sound wiser than I am. They stood in silence, the hum of the town filling the spaces between words. Distant sirens, wind through pine, the rhythmic drip from the roof. Scout sat patiently between them, looking from one face to the other, as if understanding more than either of them could say. Rachel broke the silence. You know, we're hosting another session next month. Smaller group. Vets only. No uniforms, no microphones. You might like it. Daniel hesitated, eyes tracing the horizon where the fog was lifting. Maybe, he said finally. Rachel handed him a paper cup from the vending machine. Coffee. It's terrible, but it's warm. He accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly. The heat seeped into his palms. Thank you, he said. For the coffee? For dragging me outside before I embarrassed myself. You didn't, she replied softly. You just reminded everyone that heroes are still human. The word hero made him flinch, but she didn't take it back. She just sipped her coffee, eyes on the sky. After a while, the laughter from inside the hall resumed. Life carried on. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension ebbing. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, steadier. You said you lost your partner. How do you stop seeing it? Rachel's eyes met his. You don't. You just stop fighting the memory like it's an enemy. You let it sit beside you until it gets tired too. He nodded, understanding in silence. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to fill the quiet. Scout gave a soft bark as if to end the conversation. Rachel smiled. He's got good timing. Better than mine, Daniel said, scratching behind the dog's ear. When they walked back inside, the session was nearly over. The volunteers clapped when they saw Daniel return, not mockingly, but with quiet respect. Rachel gave him a look that said more than words. You belong here, whether you believe it or not. He didn't stay for the closing remarks. But as he left, he noticed something. The silence no longer pressed on him. It moved with him, lighter somehow. That night he stood by his window, watching fog roll over the river. Scout lay beside him, muzzle on his boot. For months he had lived with the noise of the past. Now he realized sometimes even silence can speak, and not all of it is cruel. Winter returned to Windmere with sharp teeth. By December, frost painted the windows white, and the river ran under a thin crust of ice that groaned in the night. The town had grown used to Daniel Cross's quiet presence, the veteran who walked his dog before sunrise, always nodding politely but never staying long to talk. Yet beneath that calm, something had begun to shift. Rachel's visits, the community sessions, and Scout's warm loyalty had thawed the silence that once surrounded him. That evening, the snow fell heavy and fast, a storm that crept in from the north, the kind locals said could swallow a house whole. The radio crackled warnings across every channel. Visibility under 50 feet, stay indoors, emergency services on alert. Daniel was in his kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, when he heard the faint whine from Scout. The German shepherd stood by the door, ears pricked, tail still, alert. Daniel muted the radio. What is it, boy? Then came the sound, the shrill beep of his old police scanner on the counter, a leftover from his ranger days. Through the static, a frantic voice. All units, child missing. Male, age 7, last seen near the general store. Possible loss during storm. Daniel froze. He knew that voice. Rachel Hayes. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and Scout's leash. Come on, partner." The street outside was a blur of white, snow swirling in violent gusts. Daniel pulled his collar high, his breath misting in the air. Scout trotted ahead, nose low, ears cutting through the wind like radar. The town square was nearly deserted. Through the haze, Daniel saw a handful of officers coordinating near the general store's awning, headlights cutting through snow. Rachel stood at the center, her uniform dusted white, her voice firm despite the cold. "Cross," she called when she spotted him. "What are you doing out here?" "Heard the call," he said, trudging closer. "Thought you could use extra eyes." She hesitated. Technically, civilians weren't supposed to join searches, but this was Windmere. And this was Daniel. "All right," she said. "We lost the trail behind Miller's woods. Father said the boy wandered after their dog." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "How long? Over an hour?" He nodded once. "Then he's moving downhill. Wind's pushing that way." Rachel frowned, surprised. "You're sure?" "I know how people move when they're scared," he replied simply, and so they split. Rachel with 2 officers toward the west road, Daniel and Scout toward the tree line beyond the frozen creek. The woods were dark and restless. Branches groaned under the weight of snow. Scout led the way, nose darting from one drift to another. The flashlight beam cut a narrow path through the storm, revealing little more than shapes and shadows. After 10 minutes, Scout stopped abruptly, pawing at something half-buried. A small blouse. Glove frozen stiff. Daniel crouched and picked it up. "Good boy," he whispered, clicking the radio. "Hayes, I've got a lead. Child's glove near Old Storage Road, South Ridge." "Copy that," Rachel's voice came through, crackling. "We're en route." Daniel pressed on, heart pounding. The snow deepened, reaching his knees. The wind howled between the trees, but beneath it he thought he heard it, a faint, trembling cry. He switched off his flashlight, listening. There. A whimper, then silence. He turned toward the sound, pushing through drifts until the beam caught something, a small figure curled beside an abandoned shack, barely visible beneath a collapsed roof. Daniel knelt beside the boy, who couldn't have been older than 7. His face was pale, lips blue, breath shallow. The child's dog, a little beagle, lay beside him, trembling but alive. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, shrugging off his jacket. "You did good, holding on this long." He wrapped the boy in his coat and signaled Scout. "Stay close, boy. We're getting him home." Through the snow he radioed again. "Found him. He's cold, weak, but breathing. Sending coordinates." Rachel's voice broke through with relief. "We're coming. Hold on, Daniel." He smiled faintly at the use of his first name. It took 15 minutes before the headlights cut through the storm. Rachel and 2 paramedics appeared, their faces raw from the wind. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, checking his pulse. "He's hypothermic, but stable. You saved his life." Daniel shook his head. Scout did. He found the trail. Rachel glanced at the German shepherd, who sat proudly by the boy, tail wagging faintly despite the cold. "Then you both did." As the paramedics carried the child toward the ambulance, Rachel stood, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You shouldn't have been out here alone," she said, though her voice lacked anger. "Neither should he," Daniel replied, nodding toward the boy. For a long moment they stood in the snowfall, the storm easing into quiet flakes. Rachel's eyes softened. "You ever think maybe this town needs you more than you realize?" Daniel didn't answer, but when she smiled and turned toward the road, he looked up, the sky breaking open just enough to show a single star through the gray. Later that night, after Scout was dried and fed, Daniel sat by the window with a mug of coffee. His hands still trembled faintly from the cold, but there was warmth somewhere deeper, the kind he hadn't felt since before the ambush in Helmand. He reached down and scratched behind Scout's ear. "First time in a long while," he said quietly. "I feel like I did something right." Scout lifted his head, amber eyes steady. Daniel exhaled, the steam from his breath rising toward the glass. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. For the first time in years, so had the one inside him. The storm that had nearly buried Windmere passed, leaving behind a fragile calm. Snowdrifts piled against doorways, and icicles hung from rooftops like frozen daggers. For several days the town slowed to a hush, as if everyone was still catching their breath from the night a child almost vanished into the blizzard. At the edge of town, Daniel Cross's apartment glowed faintly through the frosted window. Inside, a fire crackled in the small stove, throwing orange light across the room. Scout, the loyal German shepherd, lay stretched out on a folded blanket by the hearth, his right paw wrapped in a soft bandage. The injury wasn't serious, just a strain from trudging through deep snow during the search. But Daniel insisted on keeping it clean. "You're not built for retirement any more than I am," he murmured, pouring warm broth into a bowl and setting it near Scout's head. The dog gave a soft grunt, tail thumping once. Daniel smiled faintly, then leaned back in his chair. The apartment no longer felt so empty. The walls, once bare, now held small touches. A photo of his old ranger unit beside a new one from the community training Rachel had convinced him to attend. A thermos she'd forgotten on his counter. A folded blanket she'd left after bringing coffee one morning. Little signs of life returning. A knock sounded at the door. He already knew who it was before Scout's ears even twitched. When he opened it, Rachel Hayes stood in the snowlight, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, a paper bag in one arm, and that same determined half-smile on her face. "Evening, Cross," she said. "Figured I'd check on your partner." Daniel stepped aside. "You know he's milking this injury for all it's worth." Rachel laughed softly, kneeling beside Scout. "A hero deserves the best care," she said, scratching behind his ears. "And you, Mr. Cross, don't look like you've eaten anything that wasn't canned in weeks." "That's an exaggeration," he said dryly, though the smell of the soup from her bag betrayed him. "Uh-huh," she teased, setting the bag on the counter. "Lucky for you, I brought reinforcements." They ate by the fire, her homemade stew steaming in chipped bowls, Daniel's old record player humming low in the background, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and thyme. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters, but inside it was warm, safe, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything. Rachel glanced around the room. "You've made this place look lived in." Daniel shrugged. Scout insisted. "Scout?" she asked, amused. "Yeah," he said. "He wanted curtains." Rachel laughed. Not politely, but freely, the sound surprising both of them. When the laughter faded, she looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, for someone who avoids people, you've got a knack for keeping them alive." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Old habits," she hesitated, stirring her soup. "I read the report from the rescue. You didn't have to go out there that night." "I did," he said simply. "Some things you don't choose." Her gaze softened. "You ever stop to think maybe you were supposed to?" He met her eyes across the firelight, steady, questioning, kind. "You think everything happens for a reason?" "I think sometimes we're sent reminders," she replied, "that we're still needed." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the fire and Scout's slow breathing. Finally, Daniel leaned back, staring into the flames. "You know, my team had this saying," he began quietly. "Ramirez, my best friend, came up with it. He used to say, 'If you make it home, you live for the ones who didn't.' I always thought that meant staying alive." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "And now?" Daniel's eyes reflected the fire. "Now I think it means doing something with the time they gave you." Rachel looked down at her bowl, blinking away the sting of emotion. "He sounds like someone I would have liked." "He would have liked you too," Daniel said softly. He liked people who didn't flinch when things got hard. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. Two people sitting in the afterglow of shared loss, neither trying to fix it, just acknowledging it existed. After a while, Rachel stood, setting her bowl aside. "I should get going. Early shift tomorrow." Daniel rose with her, grabbing her coat from the chair. "Thanks for dinner." She slipped her arms into the sleeves, smiling faintly. "Thanks for letting me bring it." At the door she paused, one hand on the knob. "Daniel?" "Yeah?" Maybe living for the ones who didn't make it doesn't have to mean carrying them forever. Maybe it just means remembering and still moving forward. He looked at her for a long moment, the fire's reflection flickering in his eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but some nights remembering is the only thing that keeps me steady." Rachel nodded, understanding. "Then I hope you never forget." When she left, the snow was falling again, but gently this time, soft flakes that whispered against the glass. Daniel stood at the window, watching her car's taillights fade down the hill. Scout shifted by his chair, sighing contentedly. He knelt beside the dog, rubbing his neck. "She's right, you know. I can't keep living like I'm still out there." Scout thumped his tail, eyes half closed. Daniel smiled faintly. "Guess you'll keep me honest, huh?" The fire crackled behind them, throwing warm light against the walls. On the table sat Rachel's forgotten thermos, the one she'd left weeks ago, now filled with fresh coffee. Daniel poured himself a cup and stared at the flames, feeling the first faint flicker of something he hadn't known in years. Faith, not in God perhaps, but in the idea that broken things, men, dogs, even towns, could be made whole again if given enough warmth and time. Winter loosened its grip on Windmere, but the cold still lingered like an uninvited guest. The snow along the sidewalks had turned to gray slush, and the wind carried a wet chill that smelled faintly of rust and smoke. For Daniel Cross, the days had fallen into a quiet rhythm. Early walks with Scout, fixing the truck, brief nods to neighbors who no longer stared at him like a stranger. Yet peace, he knew, was always temporary. That morning he started a part-time job at the Windmere Storage Depot, a sprawling industrial complex at the edge of town. The building had once stored grain, but now its cavernous halls were lined with crates, machinery, and shadows. The pay was modest, but the work kept his hands busy and his mind steady. The site supervisor, Carl Benton, was a stocky man in his 50s with thinning hair and a voice like gravel dragged over metal. "Keep an eye out for the night deliveries," Carl said, handing Daniel a clipboard. "Some contractors use the back entrance after hours. All legal, supposedly." "Supposedly?" Daniel asked. Carl shrugged, lighting a cigarette. "Let's just say not everyone likes paperwork. You see anything strange? Call me." Daniel nodded, noting the unease in the man's tone. He'd learned long ago to trust small hesitations. They often revealed more than words. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Daniel kept mostly to himself, his only company the hum of the old generators and Scout's quiet pacing when he brought him along for evening shifts. But on Thursday night, just before midnight, Scout began growling low at the far end of the warehouse. Daniel followed his gaze. Through the slats of the loading dock door, faint headlights flickered. A truck, no company markings, was backing into the lot, engine idling. Two men stepped out, their movements sharp, nervous. They began unloading large wooden crates into a side entrance marked Storage C. Daniel frowned. That wing hadn't been used in months. He slipped his phone from his pocket, snapping a quick photo through the gap. Then he sent a brief message to Rachel. "Strange delivery. 11:47 p.m. Warehouse C, no manifest. Might want to check." He expected no immediate reply, but minutes later his phone buzzed. "Stay put. Units en route. Don't engage." The phrase, "don't engage," was like waving a red flag before a bull. He exhaled slowly, crouching behind a stack of pallets. Scout lay low beside him, ears twitching. The men outside moved fast, too fast for a normal delivery. One carried a short-wave radio. The other wore a dark parka with a pistol holstered under the flap. Daniel's instincts flared. This wasn't smuggling cheap liquor or spare parts. The crates were too heavy, sealed too tight, military surplus, maybe. 10 minutes later, the soft wail of sirens began to rise in the distance. The men froze. One of them hissed something in panic. Then came the shout. "Cops, move it!" Everything erupted at once. The truck roared to life, reversing toward the exit. Daniel bolted from cover as one of the smugglers drew his weapon. Scout lunged forward, barking fiercely. The gunman fired, a deafening crack that echoed through the warehouse. Daniel dove sideways, tackling the man to the ground. The weapon skidded across the floor. Scout leapt, pinning the second man by the arm, teeth bared but controlled. Daniel wrenched the pistol away and chambered the slide with practiced precision, holding it steady. Then he heard her voice. "Daniel!" Rachel Hayes burst through the side door with 2 officers, snow swirling in behind her. Her flashlight swept over the scene. Daniel kneeling over one man, Scout restraining another. "You all right?" she called, weapon drawn. "Fine," he said between breaths. "But they weren't expecting you this soon." "We were closer than you think," she replied, cuffing one of the men. The second suspect tried to lunge, but Scout's growl froze him mid-motion. Rachel looked at the dog, shaking her head in disbelief. "You ever consider training him for canine work?" Daniel managed a faint grin. "He already trained me." When backup arrived, the warehouse filled with flashing lights and echoing radios. Officers began prying open the crates. Inside were stacks of stolen firearms, all traced to federal shipments reported missing months earlier. Rachel turned to him, voice low. "You realize if you hadn't called, this would have gone straight through town unnoticed." Daniel shrugged, but his jaw tightened. Just doing what seemed right. She studied him for a moment, her expression a mix of admiration and worry. "You could have been killed." He glanced at the weapon still in his hand before unloading it and placing it on a crate. "I've been worse off," her voice softened. "That's not the point." For a moment they just stood there, sirens fading, wind slipping through broken panels, the night holding its breath. Finally, Daniel said quietly, "I just didn't want to lose anyone else tonight." Rachel froze, the words cutting through her composure. It wasn't about duty. It was about memory, about Helmand, about Ramirez. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You didn't. You saved people again, Daniel. You keep doing that, whether you realize it or not." He looked away, exhaling slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. "Then maybe I'm finally learning how to fight the right battles." When the last of the smugglers were loaded into patrol cars, Rachel approached Scout, kneeling to stroke his fur. "You're the real hero here, huh?" Scout leaned into her hand, tail swaying. Daniel smiled faintly, fatigue creeping into his eyes. "He likes you. He doesn't do that with everyone." Rachel rose, her face lit faintly by the red-blue strobe of police lights. "That's because he knows good company, when he sees it." As the convoy pulled away, Daniel stood by the warehouse door, the cold night air brushing against his skin. Rachel lingered for a moment longer, her breath forming white clouds in the dark. "Go home, Daniel," she said softly. "Get some rest. You've earned it." He nodded, looking past her toward the quiet horizon. "Rest sounds nice. Haven't done that in years." When she finally drove off, Daniel and Scout stood alone in the snow-choked lot. The lights faded, leaving only silence and the faint hum of distant power lines. He looked down at Scout. "You did good, partner." Scout wagged his tail once, pressing his head against Daniel's leg. Together they turned toward home, two soldiers of different kinds walking through the cold toward the first light of dawn. Spring crept into Windmere quietly, like a gentle apology after a long, bitter winter. The snow melted from the rooftops, revealing the gray shingles beneath. The river thawed, whispering softly as it moved again. For the first time in months, sunlight filled Daniel Cross's apartment. Golden, honest, unfiltered. He stood by the window that morning, a mug of coffee in one hand, watching children ride bicycles down the street. Scout lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, tail sweeping lazily back and forth. The dog's paw had healed completely, though Daniel still caught him limping occasionally, more for sympathy than pain, he suspected. The world outside no longer looked like a place he didn't belong. A knock came at the door, not the sharp, official kind, a light, familiar one. When he opened it, Rachel Hayes stood there, hair loose from its usual ponytail, wearing a soft gray sweater instead of her uniform. The smile she gave him wasn't the professional courtesy of an officer. It was warmer, quieter. "Morning," she said. "I come bearing news." He raised an eyebrow. "The good kind or the bureaucratic kind?" "Both," she replied, stepping inside. She held up an envelope bearing the town's seal. "The mayor and the local veterans board want to offer you a position, official community advisor and emergency response trainer, permanent." Daniel blinked, surprised. "I didn't apply for anything." Rachel smiled faintly. "You didn't have to. People notice when you keep saving their lives." He gave a small chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was just in the right place at the wrong time." "Or maybe," she said softly, "you're finally in the right place." He looked at her for a long moment, the words sinking in. Then he turned toward Scout. "What do you think, partner?" Scout barked once, decisive, commanding. "That's a yes," Rachel said, laughing. Later that week, a small ceremony was held at the Windmere Town Hall. It wasn't grand, just a gathering of neighbors, officers, and a few familiar faces. Rachel stood near the podium, in uniform again, as the mayor handed Daniel a framed certificate. "Windmere is proud to name Daniel Cross as Community Emergency Liaison and Veterans Support Trainer," the mayor said, voice echoing lightly through the room. "A man who has turned silence into service and scars into strength." The applause that followed was gentle but genuine. Daniel wasn't one for speeches, but he stepped forward anyway, clearing his throat. "I'm not good with words," he began, glancing at Rachel, "but I used to think that surviving meant staying alive. Turns out it means learning how to live again. I couldn't have done that without this town, without people who didn't stop believing." His eyes met Rachel's briefly before he looked away. "And without this guy," he added, patting Scout's back. The crowd chuckled softly as Scout barked in proud agreement. After the ceremony, Daniel found himself outside beneath the warm light of early evening. The air smelled of pine and new grass. He leaned against the old railing of the steps, watching people drift away in small groups. Rachel joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the refreshments table. "I think you just got yourself a real job," she said, handing him one. He smirked. "Guess I'll have to shave." "Don't you dare," she teased. For a while they stood in silence, the kind that felt earned. The town's lights flickered on, one by one. Porch lamps, shop signs, windows glowing amber in the dusk. "You know," Rachel said quietly, "when I first met you, I thought you were just another man trying to disappear." Daniel looked out toward the horizon where the last streaks of sunlight painted the sky. "Maybe I was, but disappearing doesn't fix anything. Turns out you've got to stand watch over something to feel alive." "Stand watch?" she echoed. He nodded. "Yeah. Out there, it was my team. Now, it's this place. These people." He paused, a small smile forming. "You." Rachel met his gaze, her voice soft but steady. "Then maybe it's my turn to stand watch with you." Neither said more. They didn't need to. Scout sat between them, head resting on Daniel's boot, eyes half closed, as if he understood every word. The sun dipped below the ridge, bathing the town in gold. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly, not for ceremony, but for the simple passing of another day. That night, Daniel hung the framed certificate above his desk, beside the photo of his old Ranger unit. The two pictures, one from war, one from peace, seemed to balance each other perfectly. On the desk sat Rachel's thermos, still there after all these months, filled now with fresh coffee. Next to it, a small brass tag that read, "Scout, Canine Honor Companion." Daniel smiled at the sight, then turned off the light. Through the open window the night wind carried the quiet sounds of Windmere. A distant train, a dog barking, laughter from a diner down the street. He stood for a moment, letting it all in. Once, silence had been his enemy. Now it was home. "Come on, partner," he said, patting his leg. "We've got a world to keep an eye on." Scout rose, stretching, tail wagging as they stepped out onto the porch together. The stars were clear, the air cool, and in that stillness Daniel finally felt it. The peace that comes not from forgetting, but from watching over what remains. At the edge of town, under the soft hum of streetlights, a soldier and his dog kept their quiet vigil, not guarding a battlefield, but the fragile, beautiful life that had finally learned to let them stay. Sometimes God's miracles don't come as thunder or light. They come as quiet acts of courage, as a hand extended in the cold, or the loyalty of a dog who never leaves your side. Daniel once believed his purpose had ended on the battlefield, but grace found him again, not through medals or glory, but through kindness, through service, through the small, sacred duty of watching over others. Maybe that's how miracles work. They don't fix the past. They heal the heart that carries it. They remind us that faith still breathes in every good deed, every gentle word, every dawn after a dark night. So if this story touched you, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment with a prayer, and let someone know they're not forgotten. Because in every corner of this world, someone like Daniel or someone like you is still learning how to live again. May God bless you, your family, and every brave soul still walking toward the light.